Need to hit record. But please take it away.
Thank you, Vance, and thank you everyone for joining today. Just want to make sure, am I sharing the right thing here? Yeah, okay, cool. I'm really excited about being a part of this event. I'm really excited to hear Dawn's talk. And so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some of the things going on in my lab, some of the things that we've been working to advocate for in the broader biomedical research community. So neuroscientists are interested in trauma because trauma exposure can lead to debilitating mental health problems for millions of people. And so among adults in the United States, there are a number of different mental illnesses that can arise after exposure to a trauma. Those, of course, include post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects nearly 4% of the population, major depressive disorder, which affects over 8% of the population, and as well as a range of anxiety disorders, which collectively affect about 1/5 of the population. So trauma-related disorders are very prevalent and very debilitating to the people who suffer from them. And so when you think about a trauma, you probably initially think of a single brief event, right? Something like what you can see on the left side of this diagram here, right? Something like an accident or a plane crash, maybe being involved in a hurricane or an earthquake, some kind of assault or interpersonal traumatic event. But there are also long-term traumas that can lead to these disorders as well, and those include things like domestic abuse, childhood abuse, terminal illnesses, as well as even living through a pandemic like we all are doing now. And accordingly, since the start of the COVID pandemic, we have seen a rise in major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders, PTSD, and these things are particularly affecting women. And probably at this point, this is not news to most of the people on this call. This has been in the news a lot, that there are disproportionate ways in which just sort of living through the coronavirus pandemic is affecting women in a unique way. And that is borne out in the data when you look at the prevalence of major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders. So what you're looking at in these 4 graphs across the x-axis for each one is age in years of the person. And then the y-axis is prevalence of major depressive disorder or anxiety disorders. And the sort of peach and the blue bands are showing prevalence before COVID-19 happened and since then. And what you can see is that, of course, these disorders have gone up in both men and women, but they have gone up much more significantly in women, especially women sort of in the under 50 range. So understanding specifically how traumatic events, traumatic experiences can contribute to mental health problems in men and women differently is a major issue that something my lab is trying to understand. It's important to know, however, that even before coronavirus hit, these gender differences were very much well documented. And so this is a little graph from a paper that came out in 2015 showing the incidence of a number of mental illnesses and the ratio between men and women. And what you can see here is that these disorders at the top, PTSD, panic disorder, anxiety disorders, and major depressive disorders, are all at least twice as common in women as they are in men, while there are other disorders in which the relationship is the reverse. So there's clearly a role that sex can play in driving susceptibility or resilience to different kinds of mental illnesses. And again, from a basic research standpoint, this is something we're really interested in trying to understand what the neurobiological basis of these differences is. So part of the problem here is that biomedical researchers don't really like to study females in the lab. What you're looking at here is a graph of basically all science publications for the last 100 years, and whether or not the animals used in these papers were male or female, or whether they just didn't even bother to state the sex of the animal. And so what you can see is that from the early 20th century, basically up until the late 1960s, most research papers just didn't even say whether they were using male or female animals in their research. The ones that did were sort of comparably low. However, around 1970, a new FDA initiative went into effect, saying that basically if you were publishing scientific research, you had to state the sex of your animals. And so what you can see here is there's basically a big trade-off suddenly, where now we were studying lots and lots of male animals, the paper studying female animals remained low, and now we have fewer papers that don't specify. So what I think this graph shows you really nicely is that probably they were studying males the whole time. They just weren't specifying it. It was such an obvious choice to make that they didn't even feel like they needed to report that that information. And so you might ask yourself, well, why wouldn't we be studying female animals, right? They're get born in a big litter, but so it's clearly a choice not to study females. And probably guess what the answer is, and it is, of course, crazy female hormones. So this graph is showing the fluctuations in several reproductive hormones in rodents, so rats and mice on the left and humans on the right. And what you can see is that in both cases, there is a hormonal cycle that is characterized by some hormonal peaks and some periods of low hormone levels. And the general thinking was that these variations in hormone levels in the blood would cause the data to be kind of messy. And so this is, things that for a long time, scientists were not even afraid to say out loud. Basically, people would say, well, there's hormones involved, and some of my animals are going to have high estrogen, and some of my animals are going to have low estrogen. And so I'm just going to go ahead and do males because it's going to make their data cleaner, and therefore I will be able to prepare my, my papers more quickly. And this kind of message, I think, has been also put across in society. We think of men as being very simple and easy to understand, and women as being very complicated. But it turns out that's not actually the case when you look at the real data. There's been a couple of really nice meta-analyses over the last decade or so where the authors really took heroic efforts to characterize the variability within the data collected from neuroscience experiments in males and females, right? So this is what the supposed concern is about, is that your data points, if you use a cohort of females, are going to be all over the place, and males are going to be like nice and tight and clean. And it turns out that's not the case at all. In some cases, males are actually more variable than females in terms of the data you collect from them. The estrous cycle could be contributing to some variability that you do see in females, but whatever that contribution is, it isn't worse than any variability that you see in males. And so in both rats and mice, we now can show that the hormone cycle isn't something that's going to just like mess up your experiment. Okay. And so the big question here is, to me, what have we been missing all of this time with decades and decades of neuroscience research, especially research trying to understand what happens to a brain that experiences a traumatic event? what have we been missing? Have we been looking at the wrong things? If we're trying to do translational research, how do we identify what symptoms we want to treat if we don't even really know if we're looking at the right thing? And so in my lab, we study trauma using a very, very sort of classic technique called Pavlovian fear conditioning. And so this paradigm involves placing the rat in a chamber. And what happens to it is it hears an auditory tone. And as soon as the tone ends, the animal gets a little foot shock through the floor. So it learns to associate those two things. It knows that the tone predicts shock, and then it will exhibit a fear response in response to that tone, even if it's in a new context. So we usually have a 2-day paradigm. It gets fear conditioned, and then the next day we only play the tone without any foot shock, and we look at the animal's behavior. Now, we've been measuring fear in fear conditioning experiments by looking at how much time the animal spends in a freezing posture. And so this animal here is exhibiting that posture, think kind of like deer in the headlights type situation. The animal is just not moving at all. But when you're collecting these data, you're basically just asking, or at least historically, is the animal freezing or not? And anything that falls into the not category is simply not analyzed as real data. But there are maybe some other things that animals can do to express fear. And one of the behaviors that was noticed actually first by my grad student, Tina Gruna, now over 5 years ago, she was watching all these videos and she's like, some of the animals, the tone comes on, and instead of freezing, they start running around the chamber like they're trying to escape. And my impression is that I think the animal knows what the tone means. It's figured it out. It's afraid of it. It's just not freezing. So how do I score that? And so what we found was actually that this kind of behavior was mostly exhibited by females. And so these are data where if the females were not freezing because they were doing this other behavior, we would have interpreted their freezing, their low freezing behavior to mean that they either didn't learn the association, so their learning was impaired, or that they simply didn't have any fear response to the tone at all. And it seems neither of those things is true. They're just using a different behavioral strategy to express that fear. And so I'm going to show you a couple of different videos collected in my lab. So here's a male, he's exploring an environment and the tone comes on. You can't hear the tone, that's why I put the thing there. And so now this animal is freezing. And you can see he's just sitting very still. And this is essentially what it will do for the entirety of the tone being on, even beyond that, right? So it probably looks like the video is frozen. I assure you it is not. However, if we look at what happens in for a female, you can see she's still also exploring the chamber, looking around, the tone comes on, she has spun around, she runs to the other side of the chamber, she's looking around. There's a lot more activity here, but you wouldn't say that that's not a response to the tone itself. So now this is a little bit of freezing, but you'll see that this doesn't last very long here. She's a little curious. She's kind of slowly creeping out to see if it's safe to emerge. But what you can see is that those are very different. Oh, that was going to loop again. Those are very different responses if you're trying to categorize what is happening to the animal. What does it think that tone means? They both represent that the animal knows what the tone means. They know it means fear, but behaviorally, these things look very different. And so what we've been trying to do in the lab is try to understand what other behaviors can we look for, what correlates are there of everything the animal is doing while it's going through fear conditioning, and what can that tell us about sex differences in behavioral diversity. And so a couple of the things we've been looking at are, one, how does the animal react when it gets that foot shock? And two, is it making any sounds that are indicative of its psychological state? And what we see is that these things map onto behavior very differently in males and females. So what we see in the females is, if we look at what happens when they get shocked, we sort of measure the velocity with which they move, like with which they jump when they get shocked. The females have a much greater shock response compared to the males. And that's shown in this graph on the left. They're moving almost twice as fast. In contrast, we've been measuring ultrasonic vocalizations. So rats, of course, can squeak in a way that we can hear them, but they also have ways of communicating with each other at frequencies that we can't hear. And that's what we've been measuring using these special microphones in the lab. And what we find is that the males make way more alarm calls than the females do. Basically, once they get maybe 2 shocks, they start crying the entire session and they basically don't stop, whereas the females are not emitting as many of these calls. So it seems that there may just be completely different metrics for really trying to capture what the experience of the animal is. Whether it's a female, we might be really interested in looking at the shock response, and for males, we might want to look at the ultrasonic vocalizations that they're making. And so what we've been doing on a neurobiological level is to look at differences in neural circuitry. So in behavioral neuroscience now, circuits are all the rage. We're really interested into what brain regions talk to each other and how they do that. And so what my grad student Julia did was she injected a fluorescent virus into an area of the brain called the periaqueductal gray, which is known to mediate pain responses as well as some of the behaviors that we see during fear conditioning. And that's going to label cells in the prefrontal cortex that project to that brain, right? So it's going to show that neural connection. And when we looked at the males, and I would just want to draw your attention, this is an area of the brain called the anterior cingulate. It's part of the prefrontal cortex. We see very little labeling here in the males, and this is in accordance with what all the textbooks say. They say the ACC doesn't project to the periaqueductal gray. It's just not a very strong circuit. But when we looked at females, we see tons of labeling. And so basically, this has just never been seen before because all the textbooks contain research that's been done in males. And so we're essentially identifying a brand new circuit that may be mediating some of these pain-related behaviors specifically that we see in females. And so we're really excited to try and manipulate the circuit and see how that changes the animal's behavior. Oh, and I am going to show you this very cool video that we took. So now we are looking at this circuit in 3D using a really cool technique that shows, that allows you to basically clear all the fat out of the brain and then just look at the fluorescent parts. And it's so beautiful. I couldn't not include this. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think, this research is really important because the drugs that we develop come from the research that we do in labs like mine, and we don't even know if they're going to work if we're targeting circuits that don't exist. So there's really a lot of the benefit that we can have from studying both sexes in the lab. There is a little bit of promising news, which is in 2016, the NIH mandated that everyone who is asking for money for their biomedical research has to use both male and female animals in their work. And so this, even in the last 5 years, has created a lot of studies that are doing both sexes now, identifying sex-specific gene patterns of gene expression, neural circuits like we're seeing, as well as new behaviors related to mental health. So with that, I will stop and thank my lab for all their hard work, and I'm happy to take a question or two if we have time.
Great. Wow, that was super interesting. We do definitely have time for a couple questions. Yeah, anyone in the audience, you can speak up or use the chat, either way.
Hi, Rebecca. I have a question. Hello.
Hi.
Am I audible? Perfect. I was curious about one of the things which caught my eye on your data. It is about the correlation in the sound frequency to the number of alarm calls. How do you interpret that? And the other important aspect which really draws my attention to the PTSD is females having higher prevalence compared to males. Is there a way that I do understand hormones do play or contribute to some of the higher prevalence in that, but is there any other reasoning for a higher prevalence of PTSD in females? Thank you.
Great question. So we are not sure yet how to interpret the sex difference in alarm calls during fear conditioning. It seems to be in line with some other data that's already out there, but what the rats are hoping to achieve with these alarm calls is not entirely clear. I mean, so it's possible it's just kind of like a coping mechanism, and the males and females have different coping mechanisms. I don't want to anthropomorphize too much, but some of you have probably seen there's human research that shows that people can withstand pain better if they're allowed to curse. And so that was like one of the first things that kind of came to my mind when I saw that, is that this is allowing the males to, sort of just like withstand what they're going through in a better way than what the females might be. As far as your second question, trying to understand the dynamics between hormones and PTSD susceptibility is really tricky, because of course women can get PTSD at any time in their life. It doesn't matter if they're pre-pubertal, postmenopausal, what phase of their menstrual cycle. It's not like traumas only happen, in one phase, especially some of the chronic traumas like we've been talking about with, the pandemic. So that's still kind of an ongoing question. And of course, don't forget males have hormones too. So that's another thing we're thinking about. Other questions?
We have time for one more quick question if someone has
one. I have a quick question if no one else wants to. So I don't myself do animal research, so apologies if this is attributing too much mental reasoning, but as I'm understanding it, it sounds like the rats are both appraising the situation as being a threat, but deciding that they have different strategies for how they want to cope with it. And one is escape oriented, one is freezing oriented. I'm just curious if you have a sense of what would lead to those differential responses and why they might be seen more in one gender versus the other.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question we're trying to answer on a couple of different levels. Of course, one is sort of just on a mechanistic level. Are there different circuits that get activated because they exist in one sex and not the other? And so it might be as straightforward as just a structural difference. Whether there are evolutionary reasons for these kinds of behavioral differences, my guess is there probably are. It may be that males, because they're stronger or whatever, they feel like they can maybe afford the time to do some more assessment during the freezing, whereas for the females, it's better to just try and get out of there as fast as you can. There are other questions about sort of like how well are they predicting the timing of the shock, and maybe there's a sex difference in the sort of time experience. So there's still a lot to figure out. So, luckily I have tenure, so I can keep working on it.
Okay.
I saw a question pop up in the chat. Does it matter if the rats are nulliparous, do you think? Melissa Bates, thank you. That's an awesome question. And this is another very, as underrepresented as female rats are in neuroscience research, rats who have had babies are even less well represented. And, most of the rat research, you just buy your animals from the vendor and they have never been mothers before. And there is a lot of evidence from the very few number of labs who do study the effects of pregnancy on cognition and behavior, that there are, sort of stable changes to the female brain after giving birth. And I personally haven't studied it, but it's a totally ripe area for looking at experimentally.
Awesome. Okay, well let's thank Becca again, and then we'll have time afterwards. We can wrap back, but before we do that, we're going to hear from our other speaker for the day. So let me introduce him. Our second speaker is Dr. Don Robinaugh. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Applied Psychology and in the Department of Art and Design. His research is focused on better understanding the etiology of anxiety and traumatic stress disorders, with a particular focus on how these disorders may operate as complex systems. Through this work, he has seen how data visualization can play a role in shaping how we conceptualize psychological phenomena, and is interested in how better data visualization practices can be used to strengthen scientific reasoning. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Don.
Excellent. You can see the screen okay? Great. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about a causal systems perspective on understanding the response to loss and trauma. To my mind, one of the most robust findings in the literature on trauma and loss over the past 15 or 20 years is that the most common response to trauma is one of resilience or recovery. So as humans, we're incredibly resilient. We can experience even very severe and extremely distressing events and recover over an initial period of just weeks or months. However, some of the time, distress and impairment don't subside, and they can persist for years following a loss or years following a trauma. And since about 1980, with the publication of the DSM-3, we've recognized this chronic trajectory of intense psychological distress and impairment following trauma as post-traumatic stress disorder. And since just a few short days ago, with the publication of the DSM-5 text revision, the field now recognizes this chronic trajectory following bereavement as prolonged grief disorder. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about both of these today. And the work that I'm going to be sharing is rooted in a really fundamental question, which is, what is PTSD? What is prolonged grief disorder? What kinds of things are these? And I think I'll start by considering PTSD. So like most mental disorders in the DSM, PTSD refers to a syndrome, a collection of symptoms that commonly hang together. In our clinics, in our schools, our research centers, people come to us reporting a variety of problems that they're having in their lives. And for clinicians, our job is to try and find a way to support these individuals by trying to understand what led to this particular constellation of problems. So what caused these particular experiences to arise and cohere as a syndrome? And for a long time now, the idea has been that symptoms arise and hang together because they're caused by a common underlying disorder. So in this case, we would diagnose our patient with post-traumatic stress disorder, and we would conclude that our patient experiences hypervigilance to threats in the world around them and intrusive memories of their trauma because they have PTSD. So the answer to our question of what is PTSD is that PTSD is this common underlying cause. It's the thing that gives rise to the symptoms of PTSD. And our job as clinicians is to identify and treat this condition. And our job as researchers is to try and find the existential referent of this common underlying cause. And this idea has its roots really deep in the history of psychiatric research. And it's become really an entrenched metaphor for how we think about mental disorders that impacts everything from our diagnostic manuals to the funding priorities that we have in mental health research. But I think it's also an approach that has really been losing ground in recent years as people begin to grapple with this kind of reductionist simplicity that just really doesn't fit with what we're seeing in our clinics and in our research. I think Becca spoke a little bit about just that messiness is normal, that things are complex. And so this story doesn't hold up so well. And one of the challenges to this perspective came from maybe what seemed like an unusual place, which is from a group of psychometricians. So psychometricians are interested in this question because it has implications for how we measure mental disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder. So from a psychometric perspective, the relationship we've depicted here is known as reflective measurement. We just count up and assess the symptoms that reflect or indicate the presence of this underlying disorder, and that gives us a sense of the overall severity of the disorder. And one of the assumptions of this type of measurement is that the indicators of the underlying cause are themselves independent of one another. And that way, when we see the symptoms covary, we can attribute that covariance to this underlying latent variable. However, if we just look at the symptoms of PTSD, we can immediately see that there's many plausible causal relationships among these symptoms. So intrusive memories are almost by definition causally related to physiological reactions to those memories. And the aversiveness of those reactions almost certainly drives people's urgency in avoiding those memories. And the closer you look, the more you can see these potential causal relationships among symptoms. Now, from a purely psychometric perspective, this is a problem for measurement, but the more fundamental implication is that the more that we recognize these causal relationships, the less we need to appeal to some underlying unseen disorder in the first place. We now have a new answer to our question about what leads these symptoms to cohere as syndromes. So the reason from this perspective that these symptoms are hanging together is because of causal relationships among the symptoms themselves. And this simple insight has important implications. It suggests that post-traumatic stress disorder can be conceptualized not as a disease entity like a virus or a bacterium, but as a system of mutually reinforcing symptoms, and that this network can be studied using the tools of network science and system science. And the thing that I want to focus on today is how this shift in perspective gives us a new way of understanding symptoms and the syndromes that they compose. And so to do so, I'm going to talk a little bit more about prolonged grief disorder. So just like PTSD, prolonged grief disorder is a syndrome characterized by a collection of thoughts and emotions and behaviors that commonly arise together and persist following a really aversive life event, in this case, the death of a loved one. And just like PTSD, when you look at these symptoms, you can immediately see a host of plausible causal relationships among these symptoms that might help us explain why severe and impairing grief persists for some individuals, even years after the death of a loved one. And so a few years ago, my colleagues and I wanted to see if we could really investigate this idea and examine how these symptoms are related to one another. So in our first attempt to do this, we examined data from a study called the Changing Lives of Older Couples study, which is a really large multi-wave study of older adults. And in the study, more than 1,500 individuals completed a baseline assessment. And because this was a sample of older adults, over the course of the next several years, 310 of those individuals experienced the death of their spouse. And 265 of those individuals completed at least one wave of data collection at either 6, 18, or 48 months after this loss. And we use these data to try and estimate the structure of the prolonged grief disorder symptom network. So for people who aren't familiar with networks, all networks, whether in psychology or any other area of science, have two fundamental elements. They have a set of components, which are referred to as nodes, and they have relationships among those components, which I'll refer to as edges or links. And network science and system science are very interdisciplinary fields. So nodes and edges can represent anything. They can, in social networks, represent people, and edges represent relationships among them. And in airline networks, nodes represent things like airports, and edges represent flight paths. And in our network, nodes represent the symptoms of prolonged grief disorder, and the edges represent the statistical associations between these symptoms, specifically regularized partial correlations. And in this case, the thicker the edge between two nodes, the stronger the relationship between those symptoms, and blue edges indicate a positive association. And the layout of the nodes in the network is based on an algorithm which pulls nodes with many strong connections to the center of the network and pushes weakly connected nodes to the periphery of the network. So what we've done here is estimate the structure of conditional dependence relationships in the network. So if there's an edge between two nodes, it means that they are statistically dependent on one another after controlling for all the other components of the network. And the hope is that these conditional dependence relationships can therefore kind of point us towards which symptoms are directly interacting with one another. And for me, the thing that immediately stood out when we conducted this first early analysis was simply that symptoms relate differently to one another. So far from being interchangeable, as we often treat symptoms in the fields of psychiatry and psychology, symptoms are connected to one another in unique and I think conceptually meaningful ways. And some symptoms are more strongly interconnected than others. So in this analysis, we found that the most interconnected symptom in the network was referred to as emotional pain. And at the time, this finding was surprising to us. Grief researchers had long identified yearning as the hallmark feature of prolonged grief, largely because it's unique to this syndrome. It's not something that's seen, for example, in depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. From a network perspective, though, that uniqueness isn't especially important. What really matters is how much a symptom appears to be interacting with other symptoms. And our analyses suggested that in this framework, the most important symptom of prolonged grief might be those waves or pangs of intense emotional pain that are often reported by those with prolonged grief disorder. And anecdotally, after we ran these first analyses, as I would interact with my patients who were struggling with prolonged grief disorder, I began to take more notice of how often they described grief as a really painful experience, as something that hurt and as something that ached. And together with our empirical findings, this convinced my colleagues and I that emotional pain was something we wanted to better understand. And so we began what I think has been a really fruitful line of research with studies examining emotional pain in prolonged grief disorder. And we found, for example, that this self-reported emotional pain or psychological pain is really robustly associated with the overall severity of prolonged grief disorder. And in a case study in which we examined the emotional experiences that someone reports immediately following the death of a loved one, we found that psychological pain, which is in that top row, was the most intense and the most persistent negative affective experience that they reported. And it was one that they described as being really closely associated with suicidal thoughts that they were experiencing in the aftermath of the loss. So again, the key point that I want to make in showing these kinds of additional findings is just that this work was only possible because of a shift in how we thought about these symptoms, no longer seeing them as just passive indicators of grief that were only useful so that we could sum them up to a total score, and instead seeing them as these agents in a system that we really needed to understand in their own right. Now, the network approach, I think, also provides a new perspective on how we think about comorbidity. So prolonged grief disorder is commonly comorbid with PTSD and depression in bereaved adults. And just in general in mental health research, comorbidity is much more of the rule than the exception. Conditions are commonly comorbid. And as in other cases, it's not especially surprising in this context because there's a lot of symptom overlap among these disorders. And from a traditional common cause perspective, this overlap is problematic because it raises the question of whether the comorbidity that we're seeing is real, whether it's actually discrete, disease entities that are co-occurring, or whether it's just a byproduct of the means that are used to assess these underlying conditions. Now, from a systems viewpoint, we get a new perspective on comorbidity. So these are findings on the relationships among symptoms of prolonged grief and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder in a large sample of treatment-seeking bereaved adults. And in this analysis, we used a community detection algorithm to determine which symptoms tended to hang together as distinguishable communities. So in other words, which symptoms tended to be more strongly associated with each other than with the rest of the network. And we found that the symptoms of prolonged grief and PTSD and depression each hung together as their own distinguishable communities. But as you can see, the boundaries between those communities was extremely fuzzy. So for example, the PTSD symptom of feeling distant from others was strongly associated with other prolonged grief and depression symptoms, such as feeling worthless or having a loss of interest, feeling lonely, and having a difficult time trusting other people. And you can immediately see how if someone developed this symptom, that it would not only make them more vulnerable to post-traumatic stress disorder, it would also make them more vulnerable to experiencing prolonged grief and depression as well. And so you can, again, get a way of thinking, not only about these symptoms, but about the syndromes that they can pose. So for me, these studies were a really nice tentative and informative way of starting to think about mental health disorders in a new way. But there was a problem with the kinds of networks that I've presented so far. So these have been cross-sectional networks that tell us how symptoms relate to one another across people. But what we're really interested in is understanding individual differences in network structure, understanding what the network of symptoms looks like within an individual as it unfolds over time. And to illustrate why this is a problem, we can dig a little bit further into this causal systems perspective on PTSD and on prolonged grief. So from a systems perspective, causal relationships among symptoms play a really critical role in the onset and maintenance of disorders like PTSD and prolonged grief. So for example, bereavement acts as a stressor on a person that gives rise to thoughts about the death and thoughts about the person who is lost. And those thoughts may prompt feelings of emotional pain and yearning, which in turn prompts some effort to avoid the loss or to spend time with things that remind the person of their loved one. And for a time, this external perturbation pushes the person outside their usual state of being, into a state where there's some elevation in their severity of their grief. And as time passes and that loss becomes less of a proximal stressor, the network falls back into its original state of equilibrium, a state of relative health where grief might still be present to some degree, but it's no longer intrusive and severe and distressing. However, for some bereaved adults, things might proceed differently. So for example, after experiencing a loss, an individual might find that they just can't think about their loved one without also having thoughts about the death and intense feelings of emotional pain and yearning. And avoidance might become relied on as a way of coping with those intense emotions, ironically leading to more frequent intrusive thoughts about the death. And these experiences feed into and exacerbate one another. And now as time moves on and the stress of bereavement becomes less proximal, the network doesn't return to where it was. The causal relationships among these symptoms themselves are strong enough to keep the symptoms elevated and keep this person in this new state of equilibrium, where they're in this stable, chronically elevated state of intense and distressing symptoms. So from the perspective of this causal systems or kind of network approach, if we want to understand why grief and PTSD persist for some but not for others, we really need to understand how the structure of this network differs across people. And this is not something we can get from the kind of cross-sectional analyses that I've presented so far. If we want to understand the relationships among symptoms as they play out within individual people, then we need to get a lot more data on those symptoms as they unfold over people within individuals over time. So my research team is currently trying to get this work going, gathering these data by having subjects complete very brief surveys in which they rate the extent to which they're experiencing the thoughts and emotions and behaviors that we commonly think of as comprising grief on a sliding scale of 0 to 100 as they go about the course of their day-to-day life. Subjects complete 6 of these assessments per day that occur at random times within one of 6 assessment windows between the hours of 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. And they do this for about 2.5 weeks, 17 days, giving us a total of up to 102 assessment points. And what these intensive longitudinal data allow us to do is investigate how relationships among symptoms play out over the course of time in a few different ways than we were able to before. And so the first way that they allow us to is to look at the relationships within people as they unfold over time. So when people are experiencing emotional pain, do they tend to experience other things as well? And consistent with our early findings, you can see that emotional pain is one of these strongly interconnected symptoms. It's got strong associations with yearning and anxiety and loneliness, thoughts about the death and thoughts about the deceased. We also, though, are able to get a sense of the within-person temporal relationships. So how I'm feeling at a given point in time will predict how I'm going to feel at the next time point. And here we can see we get a little bit of a different picture than the one that I've been presenting so far about emotional pain. So when we look at the in strength on the far right-hand side of this figure, you can see that that's quite high. It's quite far along the right-hand side of that scale. And that's indicating the fact that a lot of things are predicting emotional pain. So the more lonely I am at a given time point, the more likely I am to feel emotional pain at the next time point. But when we look at the out strength, we can see that emotional pain is not an especially interconnected symptom. It's not really predicting a lot at the next time point. And although this obviously isn't causal information, it's at least painting a picture that emotional pain is a consequence of a lot of things, but maybe not driving a lot of the grief that we're seeing in these individuals. So it gives us a new perspective on the data and how these symptoms relate to one another. But again, I think the most important thing that it gives us is a sense of how individuals might differ. So these are just the first four individuals that are in this particular data set. And you can see that there are common themes across these individuals, like leisure time tends to be associated with positive emotions, but that's not true of every individual. There are individual differences in how these symptoms are related to one another over time. And I think that those individual differences, again, are potentially really important for us to understand when we think about how individuals might respond differently to loss and to trauma. So for me, the hope in doing this as this work proceeds is that we'll not only have a new way of thinking about symptoms and syndromes, but also new tools for better understanding and supporting people as unique individuals who are struggling with loss and with trauma. So thanks to my many collaborators who helped out with this work, and thanks to all of you for listening.
Wonderful. Thanks, Don. Yeah, round of applause. I see all the emojis. I love that. Great. Any questions for Don at this point? Feel free to speak up or drop them in chat.
Quick question, actually. That was really beautiful. Such a powerful way of looking at data. Thank you for that. I'm just thinking about, you were saying at the end that this might actually give us new tools to, for supporting individuals, right? Not just understanding more about the disorder themselves or individual differences. I'm just wondering about, have you ever thought that it might be helpful in a more simplified way, obviously, to sort of show an individual this kind of network that's specific for them, and sort of for them to use that understanding for their own sort of, healing?
Yeah, absolutely. So people are doing this work. It's kind of ongoing. So there's not been a lot out about what exactly, how impactful this is. But people are kind of looking at two things. One is presenting people with the concept of your symptoms are all connected, your experiences are all connected. When you feel this way, it might lead you to behave this way, those kinds of things. Maybe just that simple framework gives people insight into their own experiences. And then there's the additional layer of, if we know for you, there is this statistical association that we see in our data, does that provide you unique insight into your particular experience? My sense is that right now, it's more of the former, a way of thinking in kind of a systems framework might just by itself be carrying some of these effects, but people are trying to do a comparison between those two conditions to see if there's something added by knowing the statistical associations as well.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
That was awesome. My mind is kind of spinning, but I'm curious, just in terms of your subjects, have you tracked anyone who is on medication and whether the networks kind of change across time if they are getting pharmacological treatments?
So we are collecting, so this is the data I just shared, where we're following people over time is an ongoing study. We are collecting data on medication. One of the requirements of the study is that the medication has been stable. So we're not anticipating that there'll be a lot of change here, but we will have data to check that out. And then exactly your question is the next step is, can we see changes in the network over the course of treatment?
I have a question, which is when you look at these individual systems, these individual graphs that you compile for people, are there kind of categories of graphs that show up? So is there not like a Myers-Briggs thing, but like I'm a this type of graph or this type of graph, and is there something like a sex difference or patterns like that?
Yeah, it's an amazing question, and it's one of the main things that we're hoping to do with these data. is to see if we have subtypes of networks. Obviously, when you do these networks, some of what we see is differences in that visualization could just be noise, so it's not clear that it's necessarily a substantive difference there. So what we're hoping to do is see if we have more robust evidence there are subtypes of people where they show this pattern of associations versus that pattern of associations. And so, yeah, that's an analysis I'm really excited to do.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, please.
Sir, with respect to getting a harmonized way of understanding the mental health problem and the criterias and the tools which we are coming across with respect to having a face validity versus a construct validity, how far are we able to bridge that gap and have a harmonized way of kind of getting to the problem and use a uniform scale? Because we do have the DSM-5 criteria, which we have to kind of hit those questions as well. So I'm kind of curious to know to what extent are we close to getting a criteria for just any of the mental health problems?
That's a big question. So in the context of prolonged grief disorder, people did a lot of research of trying to think about what combination of symptoms is something that indicates for us things like treatment response or probability of natural recovery and things like that. And that's how they kind of arrived at the particular set of symptoms that they have in the DSM. And I think for those purposes, there's good evidence to think that they're useful. But as you say, exactly how that relates to some kind of like construct validity that's like, we're really measuring the thing that we're interested in measuring, I think is quite an open question. So the challenging part of the DSM is that it's trying to kind of serve both researchers and clinicians. And my sense is that in this case, at least, it may be serving clinicians a little bit better than it's serving researchers at this point.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions for actually either of our speakers at this point? I'm very happy that this was a very diverse approach to a common topic. It's really interesting. If anyone in the audience has any other questions, now's your moment. I do have one more, selfishly, but which is I know sometimes with systems research you can do things like pick out emergent phenomenon that you weren't necessarily looking for at first, right? Have you seen anything of that where you see like two things always move in tandem, and so maybe we shouldn't differentiate them, or like, when you had that all three things together, maybe there's a subgraph that's more clumped that we should be calling a syndrome instead? I mean, have you noticed any emergent phenomenon like that?
I've definitely seen surprising. I'll have to give a moment. In this case, we're not like these are pretty basic, graphs, obviously. Mm-hmm. And so we're not like simulating something where we can see surprising behavior come from them. But the most surprising things in both PTSD networks and in grief networks is that the symptom of avoidance, which in a lot of behavioral theories or cognitive behavioral theories of both of these syndromes, avoidance is seen as the key to the maintenance of these disorders. So the more you're avoiding, that is the reason that you're continuing experiencing these things. Those are just not especially associated with anything. So you can see it in the figures that I just showed. They're usually associated with maybe one symptom, like emotional pain or thoughts about the death, or in case of PTSD, they're often associated with the intrusive memories, but weakly and with very little else. And I think it raises a real question of exactly how important avoidance is, or at least how do we understand this weak association with everything, given the prominence that they play in our theories of these conditions. And I think actually, sorry, but I'll let you comment in a moment, but I think it really connects to your work in how are we assessing avoidance, and are we missing some ways in which people avoid. So maybe that would you.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it seems like avoidance is almost like a product of some of the more like internal constructs that that you're looking into. So it would make sense that you would see it a lot, but on its own, it isn't necessarily like truly like a part of anything real, I guess.
Yeah.
Not anything real, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there definitely, I see a lot of parallels there in terms of like, how do we know what to really look at? What's going to really tell us what we want to know?
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, we are coming up to the hour, and I'm going to give one last chance as I'm winding down here. If you have anything that you want to say now, that's great. Otherwise, we're all at Northeastern, so reach out if you have thoughts afterwards. But I want to one more round of applause for our presenters. I think that was wonderful. I thought they were amazing and really interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. And thanks everybody for coming. If you'd like to, this was recorded. If you'd like to have access to the recording or share it with someone else who you think would be interested, give me a call, or not call, but give me an email, and I'm happy to pass that on to you. But otherwise, that'll be it. Thanks everybody.